Hello history lovers and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we will delve into the intriguing life of Henry VIII's most beloved queen, Jane Seymour, the only one out of Henry's 6 wives to provide him with a surviving male heir. We'll be continuing our story in 1536 and we'll be looking at Jane's final days. But before we start, if you're new here, make sure you like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, and without further ado, let's go. In June 1536, the Act of Succession was passed. This new Act of Succession made both Mary and Elizabeth illegitimate, although I guess in Mary's case it just confirmed that she was still illegitimate. But it stated that any children Henry and Jane would have would be put ahead of his daughters in the line of succession. It also stated, and I can't help but think he put this in as a fail-safe after the first 2 marriages, that if Jane failed to produce an issue, Henry was granted the unprecedented power to choose his own successor, which could include the issue of any other lawful wife. On the 7th of January 1536, Jane enters London in state. Compared to Catherine and Anne, Jane's entry into London was fairly low-key, most likely because the king's coffers were running low. Both Catherine and Anne had been crowned within weeks of becoming queen. There is evidence to suggest that Henry had every intention to crown Jane, and had she not died, she probably would have eventually had the ceremony. So let's go back to my pal Eustace Chapuis, who wrote to Charles V on the 19th of May, the day that Anne was executed, about Jane having a coronation, to be celebrated with great solemnity and pomp, the king intending, as I am told, to perform wonders, for he has already ordered a large ship to be built, like the one of Venice, to bring the lady from Greenwich to his city, and commanded other things for the occasion. Henry had even ordered the construction of a high walkway from the Palace of Westminster into the Abbey in preparation for Jane's coronation. We know that the work was stopped by the end of the summer of 1536, as Chapuis wrote in another letter dated on the 1st of July that the coronation had been postponed until after the 29th of September, a feast day known as Michaelmas. It was then thought that her coronation would take place on the 13th of October, St. Edward's Day, but that too was also delayed due to plague. Now, I have speculated that Jane's coronation was postponed due to the cost. I mean, Anne Boleyn's coronation was very expensive. However, Eustace Chapuis speculates that her coronation was postponed until she had proved herself by providing a male heir. He then continues, and if not, and there is danger of her being barren, occasion may be found to take another. I am told on good authority that this king will not have the prize of those who do not repent in marriage, for within 8 days after publication of his marriage, having twice met 2 beautiful young ladies, he said and showed himself somewhat sorry that he had not seen them before he was married. So her coronation never happened. If it had, she would have worn the same crown as her predecessors, an open coronal of heavy gold set with sapphires, rubies and pearls. I would love to show you a picture of it, but Mr. No Fun and No Christmas Allowed Oliver Cromwell had it melted down.
This is why we can't have nice things.
On the 13th of June 1536, Henry's daughter, the Lady Mary, offers her father her submission and signed the articles that decreed that her parents' marriage was illegitimate and that her father is the head of the Church of England. Does this mean that Mary had a change of heart?
No, definitely not.
Mary only did so after Chapuis assured Mary that the Pope absolved her from all responsibility. Henry was still not happy, as he was angry that it had taken Mary so long to agree with him. But he also sent Sir Thomas Wriothesley to ask Mary what ladies she would like in her household. Mary was so grateful that she wrote a letter to Cromwell acknowledging her faults and thanking Cromwell for helping her mend her relationship with her father. This did please Henry, and then he decided that he did want to be a loving father again. How did Jane feel about this? I imagine she was overjoyed at finally some sort of family unit was coming together, as she had also worked on repairing the father-daughter relationship. Jane was also fairly lonely as queen. There were very few ladies in her household that in status were on similar terms to herself, and those whom she had been familiar with, she had separated herself from in order to emphasise her rank as queen. So, it's kind of your own fault, Jane, but whatever. Mary, on the other hand, as the daughter of the king, was of high enough rank that Jane could frequent her stepdaughter's company and entertain a friendship with her.
Our friend, football friend! Oh, best friends forever and ever! Oh, friend!
2 days later, Jane rode beside her husband to Westminster Abbey for the opening of Parliament. The King's niece, Lady Margaret Douglas, carried her train. On the 6th of July, the King and Queen went to Hackney to meet with the Lady Mary. This was the first time that Henry had spoken affectionately of his daughter in 6 years, and was probably quite an emotional reunion. It was reported that the King was gentle and patient. Not much else was heard, as they continued the conversation in private. 2 days later, it was announced that Mary would rank as the second lady at court after Jane herself. Now that Mary was back in favour, the eldest Tudor child focused on repairing the relationship between her father and her sister. Despite facilitating a reconciliation between Henry and Mary, Jane had shown very little interest in repairing the relationship between Henry and his youngest daughter, the 3-year-old Elizabeth. But then, why would anyone want to act on the behalf of the bastard of a traitor? Mary's efforts were documented on the 21st of July when she visited her sister at Hatfield, and wrote to their father about how Elizabeth was in good health and how in time he would be proud of his youngest daughter. The September of 1536 saw the start of the Pilgrimage of Grace, which lasted until the March of 1537. As mentioned earlier, King Henry VIII had initially intended to crown Jane as queen in October, capitalising on the wealth generated by the dissolution of the monasteries. However, London and Westminster Abbey were struck by plague, leading to the cancellation of the coronation. Instead, the royal couple retreated to Windsor. Another reason it may have been delayed might have been because of the Pilgrimage of Grace rebellion. The Pilgrimage of Grace started with a riot in Louth, Lincolnshire. This riot emerged in the response to the king's religious reforms. As the rebellion gained momentum, it spread to Yorkshire, with rebels eventually occupying York. Robert Aske, a man from York, assumed leadership. The rebel army, bearing banners depicting the 5 wounds of Christ, which is where the rebellion got its name from, viewed their cause as a holy crusade, aiming to convince the king to reconcile with Rome and spare the monasteries. Despite the coronation setback, Jane received a generous jointure as queen, and there was much competition for a place in her household. One day in late October, Jane knelt before King Henry at court, pleading for him to reconsider the fate of the monasteries. His response was silence, but his visible irritation was unmistakable. She implored him to consider restoring some of the smaller monasteries, proposing that the rebellion might be seen as a divine punishment for the destruction of so many churches. Henry, seething with anger, instructed her to divert her attention to other matters. It was said, "Here's the Queen of England said to the king that perhaps God permitted this rebellion for ruining so many churches," to which he replied by telling her to attend to other things, remind her that the last queen had died in consequence of meddling too much with state affairs. However, this information should potentially be taken with a pinch of salt. We are told of this information by Cardinal du Bellay, which in itself is fine, but the last time the Cardinal was in England was in 1534. That's 2 years before the Pilgrimage of Grace. He might have had a spy network, But ultimately, he wasn't there. Jane heeded Henry's warning and refrained from further involvement in politics. In December 1536, King Henry let it be known that he would meet Ask's demand, promising, with comfortable words, to send Norfolk north to confirm the agreement. Additionally, he agreed to the rebels' demand for the Queen's coronation to be at York Minster. Ask accepted Henry's assurances with good faith, leading to the disbandment of his army, confident that the king would honour his promise. On the 8th of December 1536, Ask received formal pardon, and by Christmas 1536, Jane Boleyn, the Lady Rochford, returned to the court as Lady of the Bedchamber for the Queen. Most of Anne's previous staff had been retained, resulting in the new Queen's household closely resembling that of Anne's time. Henry also thought that his wife was pregnant, and patted her stomach, saying, "Edward, Edward." Unfortunately for Henry, Jane wasn't pregnant, but it shows that he already knew what his prince would be called. Also, Mary fainted and her father and stepmother had to get her off the floor.
Thought you ought to know.
Thanks to Mary, Elizabeth was invited to court for the Christmas festivities, and the Tudor family was whole again. Henry and Jane sat together at the table, and Jane and Mary sat opposite each other. Elizabeth didn't sit with the adults on the account that she was 3. It was noted that the king was very affectionate towards his youngest daughter during that time. On the 21st of December 1536, Jane's father passed away at Wolfhall. Her father had largely remained out of the public eye. As a result, there was no court mourning. Jane did not attend the funeral, raising the possibility that she might not have been particularly close to her father. In recent years, she had rarely seen him, and there is no record to indicate any significant emotional impact on her part following his death. During the spring of 1537, Queen Jane stood sponsor at the christening of her niece, who also bore the name Jane Seymour. Honestly, the Seymours have like 3 names. Her niece, Jane Seymour, was the daughter of her brother, Edward Seymour, and would later go on to be the sole witness at the wedding of Lady Catherine Grey and her brother, who was also named Edward Seymour. See what I mean? I meant Jane Seymour's brother, though, not Lady Catherine Grey's brother, because she didn't have one. The Lady Mary and Thomas Cromwell were also in attendance at the christening. By the end of that spring, Jane herself would finally fall pregnant, and by all accounts, it was a pretty normal pregnancy. Her pregnancy was announced in the April, but the Queen had a rather odd craving. Well, by our standards anyway. Jane craved quail eggs. However, these were out of season, and so Henry had to get them shipped from Calais. Lady Lisle, who was in Calais, was desperate to get her daughters a place at court, and Jane essentially agreed to take on one of her daughters in exchange for a supply of quail eggs. Although when supply was low in Calais, they did outsource to Flanders. Lady Lisle sent both of her daughters to England so Jane could choose her favourite to be in her entourage. Jane chose the older sister, Anne Bassett. The younger Bassett, Catherine, joins the household of the Duchess of Suffolk. Jane's main companions during her pregnancy were her sister Elizabeth, who was now the wife of Thomas Cromwell's son Gregory, and her stepdaughter, the Lady Mary. On the 16th of September 1537, Jane Seymour entered her period of confinement at Hampton Court Palace, where she would eventually give birth to her baby. The next day, Anne Bassett was sworn into Jane's service. Anne was a popular figure at court and would even attract Henry's attention. But through all of that, she kept a good reputation. The Queen was not happy with Anne Bassett's style of clothing. Anne had chosen to wear a French hood, a style made popular in England by Anne Boleyn, but this choice did not meet the Queen's approval. She insisted that the French hood had to be replaced, and thus she arranged for a gable hood to be provided instead. The Queen also found Anne's gown unsuitable. Jane requested that Anne obtain 2 new gable hoods with stiffened frontlets, and 2 high-quality gowns made of black velvet and black satin. Furthermore, Jane directed Anne to replace her coarse linen undergarments with ones of fine quality. Finally, Jane learned that there were too few pearls stitched to Anne's girdle. Jane warned her that if she did not appear at court in the proper clothes, she would not be allowed to attend the royal christening when the time came. We know that Henry was a germaphobe, but it seems that Jane might have shared the same trait, as plague ravaged London. Both the King and Queen were afraid, and those who had been to London were not to come to court on the King's order. Your ladyship would not believe how much the Queen is afraid of the sickness. Over the course of 2 days in October, the 7th and the 8th, a new baby joined the family. Henry's niece, Frances Brandon, gave birth to a girl at Bradgate Manor in Leicestershire. She was named Jane after the Queen. While in London, the Duchess of Suffolk gave birth to a boy, named Charles, after his father. The Queen herself, who was heavily pregnant, went into labour on the 9th of October, 1537. Her pregnancy had been pretty smooth sailing, but her labour was far from it, lasting 3 days.
Big blowing sack of drama say what?
Jeez, I'm just tired thinking about it. The baby was finally delivered on the 12th of October, 1537. A boy named Edward.
Breathtaking. I shall call him Mini-Me.
Henry was not with Jane, so when he received the news of the Queen's delivery, he immediately rode to Hampton Court. Edward assumes the title of the Duke of Cornwall from the moment of his birth. However, Henry never actually gave his son the title of Prince of Wales. It is noteworthy that Prince Edward was not the only newborn at Hampton Court Palace on that day. In another part of the palace, Jane's sister-in-law, Lady Beauchamp, Anne Stanhope, also gave birth to a son named Edward. Due to concerns about the plague, Henry VIII ensured that his son Edward's apartments were meticulously cleaned with soap and swept daily. Jane likely had limited contact with her son following his birth, as he had his own separate apartments and household. In contrast to Anne Boleyn, Jane did not make a fuss about nursing her own child. Instead, in keeping with tradition, she stayed in her bedchamber, attending to the task of signing letters to announce the birth to foreign courts. On the 15th of October 1537, Edward's christening took place at the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court. The godparents were Thomas Cranmer, the Duke of Norfolk, Duke of Suffolk, and the Lady Mary. The Lady Elizabeth was also part of the procession, being carried by Lord Beauchamp, Edward Seymour, the Queen's brother, while clutching the chrysobal tightly in her tiny fists. After the christening and the naming of Edward as heir, he was returned to the Queen's apartments, accompanied by his 2 sisters. This time Elizabeth walked alongside Mary, holding her hand. Jane was wrapped in furs, and then carried to a daybed. It is important to note that parents typically did not attend christening during this era. Shortly afterwards, Jane developed a fever, and just 2 days later, she was administered the last rites. Despite a brief period of improvement, her condition once again deteriorated. One of the courtiers wrote of this unfortunate turn of events. "If good prayers can save her, she is not like to die, for never lady was so much plained, with every man, rich and poor." On the 23rd of October 1537, Henry had originally planned to leave Hampton Court ready for the hunting season. However, due to Jane's condition, which had worsened since Edward's christening, he found it impossible to leave her in such a state. Instead, Henry chose to remain by Jane's side throughout the evening and into the night. Tragically, the next day, on the 24th of October, Jane quietly passed away in her sleep. The prospect of death deeply disturbed Henry, and he fled to Windsor. He couldn't bear to stay in the same residence as Jane's lifeless body. Consequently, the Duke of Norfolk was left to handle the arrangements for Jane's funeral. Henry retreated into seclusion while staying at Windsor, refusing all visitors. When Henry finally emerged from his isolation, his ministers cautiously broached the idea of a fourth marriage. emphasising its importance for the stability of the realm. To their surprise, Henry readily agreed. Perhaps, being a spare himself, he realised the need of 2 sons. Jane's body lay in state at the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court, while her entrails were buried. Her lifeless body was dressed in a robe made of golden tissue, complete with a crown upon her head, with some of her jewels. Among Henry VIII's wives, Jane Seymour was the sole one to die while holding the title of Queen, earning her a royal funeral held at Windsor. Eventually, she was joined by the King, who had requested to be buried beside the mother of his sole surviving son. We think that at the time of her death, Jane was 29 years old, as she had 29 ladies walking in her funeral procession. This was traditionally done to mark the age of those who died. This suggests her birth date to have fallen between October 1507 and October 1508. Her stepdaughter, the Lady Mary, was chief mourner. Her body was finally buried at Windsor Castle on the 12th of November 1537. Thank you for watching today's video on King Henry VIII's third wife and Queen, Jane Seymour, and the mother of the final Tudor king. If you enjoyed today's video, be sure to leave a thumbs up and make sure you subscribed if you haven't already. And I will see you in the next one. Have a wonderful day.